This is part 5 of what I said in chapter 6 of gender and development in Nigeria. In this section, I want to say what I mean when I say that structural violence contributes to gender inequality in Nigeria. As I said before in previous parts to this reading, there's a deep intertwining of structural violence and gender inequality in Nigeria. I give what I think is a comprehensive analysis of how structural violence in Nigeria is a system of embedded inequalities that then produce avoidable harm and suffering, and that this is deeply intertwined with the perpetuation of gender inequality. I demonstrate how this system operates across various dimensions of Nigerian society, creating and reinforcing disadvantages for women that limit their opportunities, agency, and representation. Ultimately, this undermines women's full participation in social, economic, and political spheres. So these are the dimensions. First, violence is used as a tool of control. I highlight how violence against women, whether perpetuated by state actors or within communities, is a pervasive manifestation of structural violence that serves to control and subordinate women, limiting their ability to exercise their rights and freedoms. I emphasize how this violence, often enacted with impunity, creates a climate of fear that restricts women's mobility and also silences their voices and discourages their participation in public life, including the political arena. I point to the prevalence of violence against women in elections and the state's inadequate response to such violence as evidence of a broader societal acceptance of violence against women, which normalizes their subordination and limits their access to power. So there's also a second dimension, which is unequal protection under the law. I demonstrate how structural violence is embedded within the legal and administrative frameworks of the Nigerian state. This creates a system where women are denied equal protection of the laws and opportunities, further entrenching gender inequality. I point to the historical and ongoing challenges that women face in accessing justice, exercising their property rights, and gaining full legal capacity as evidence of how the law itself can be a tool of structural violence that reinforces patriarchal norms and limits women's autonomy. This unequal protection, I argue, has profound implications for women's ability to participate in politics, as it restricts their access to resources, networks, and the legal standing necessary to compete on an equal footing with men. Third, there are barriers to education and economic empowerment. I emphasize how structural violence operates by creating and perpetuating barriers to education and economic opportunities for women. This traps them in a cycle of disadvantage that limits their potential and reinforces their subordinate status. Poverty, cultural norms, and insecurity disproportionately affects girls and women, and this restricts their access to education and also the skills necessary for economic empowerment. This lack of education and economic opportunities, I argue, have a direct impact on women's ability to engage in politics because it limits their access to resources, to networks, and then the confidence also that is needed to navigate the male-dominated political landscape becomes, dampened. Fourth, I look at the persistence of patriarchal norms and demonstrate how structural violence is deeply intertwined with the persistence of patriarchal norms and values that define women's roles, primarily in terms of domesticity and reproduction. Devaluing women's contributions to society and discouraging their pursuit of political ambitions. These norms, often reinforced through cultural religious beliefs, limit women's access to leadership positions, mentorship opportunities, and support systems crucial for political engagement. I argue that these deeply embedded norms, often internalized by both men and women, create a formidable barrier to women's political participation, reinforcing the notion that leadership is inherently masculine and discouraging women from challenging the status quo. The failure of state action is another dimension that I look at. I highlight how the lack of genuine political will and commitment from the Nigerian state to address the root causes of gender inequality is itself a manifestation of structural violence because it perpetuates a system that benefits from the marginalization of women, despite adopting international conventions and developing national policies aimed at promoting gender equality. I argue that the Nigerian government has consistently failed to implement these commitments in a meaningful way, often resorting to tokenistic gestures that fail to address the underlying structural inequalities. This lack of action, I contend, reinforces the power imbalances that sustain gender inequality and denies women the opportunity to exercise their full rights and freedom as equal citizens. So what I try to do is to give a compelling and multifaceted analysis on how structural violence contributes to gender inequality in Nigeria. By examining the interplay of violence, legal frameworks, economic opportunities, patriarchal norms, and state action, I demonstrate how deeply embedded inequalities create a system that systematically disadvantages women, limiting their potential and undermining their full participation in society. I make a clear case for understanding how structural violence operates not as a series of isolated incidents, but as a complex web of interconnected factors that work to maintain and reinforce the subordination of women, highlighting the urgent need for transformative change that addresses the root causes of gender inequality in Nigeria. So this is the end of this